So I think in order to really understand all of this trauma, we have to go back to the very beginning. And I think we have to go back to the slave plantation, but I think we have to even go back even further than that. And usually when you talk about the Elizabethan era, for me, I usually shut down because before now, it really wasn't an area of interest for me. I was not interested in the language. I was not interested in the culture, but that was based on the culture and the history that was presented to us. Was presented as a very separate history from my own history, but that is the birth of America that transferred across the Atlantic to the Americas, and it is the basis of all of our torturous, oppressive history. So if you can go to that first slide, the slide with the invention of race. Okay, so if we're going back to the Elizabethan era of England, and England is not the only European nation, but this type of pyramid was happening all across Europe, from Spain to France. I'm going to focus on England for right now because back in the 16th century, late 16th century, early 17th century, society was basically set up in this pyramid. And I call this pyramid a pyramid scheme. It was a pyramid scheme of oppression. It was a pyramid scheme of torture. It was an unfair system. And so basically the king owned almost everything. And his surrogates were the nobles. The knights were the ones who protected all of his or her property, Queen Elizabeth, King James, and people at the bottom were the peasants, the poor people. So back in the time, I would say around the early 1600s, when mercantile trade became a big thing, when ships started traversing the Atlantic, um, in England, there were systems not based on race, but based on family. So Irish at the time were considered a very low class. The Irish were often the serfs and the peasants, and that at that bottom rung of the pyramid were also people who were landless, maybe sex workers, maybe women, children. So at the time when ships started traversing the Atlantic, oftentimes these people at the bottom were used to go with the big ships across the country. Oftentimes they had agreed to become indentured servants with the promise of their freedom at a later time. So in England at that time, these poor people were the ones who were building the docks, the ones who were cutting trees, who were building the infrastructure of England. So when those people came to the United States of America, which was not the United States of America at that time, they were used to build bridges and to dredge swamps. So, and that is the settlement of Jamestown. These were mostly Irish. At that time in England, people would sometimes just simply disappear, and they were called being spirited away. People would say, "Oh, what happened to that person?" People would say, "Oh, they were spirited away. Somehow the spirits had come and taken them away." Those people were appropriated as servants in the United States. And so for a few decades, the country was being built on the backs of indentured servants, mostly Irish. There were a few Africans. Later, a few decades later, there was a famous indentured servant who escaped. And so because of his escaping and capture, there was a law that was created that made him a permanent indentured servant. So at the early days, the United States, that territory was basically, of course, we know about the genocide that occurred in order to take over these lands. The the land that was used was, used for growing tobacco. Once uh, cotton became a commodity, they started bringing in more Africans. And so that is the point where race started to be more deeply invented. Race is a social construct. It has nothing to do with biology. Basically, we are 99.999% the same. However, when you can easily classify people as a quote unquote race, it became easier for the slave owners, these very, very wealthy, I call them investors, because basically they were doing investments for the King of England, King James, uh, who translated the Bible, who actually had the Bible translated to justify slavery. If you'll be a good slave here on earth, you'll be rewarded in heaven. So these people who were the top of the pyramids in this pyramid scheme, it was much more easy to identify them as being at the bottom of the rung. So if you could go to the next slide. So basically, when more slaves came to the United States or to the Americas, um, as cotton began to become a commodity, and especially after the invention of the cotton gin, um, there needed to be someone to control the slaves or to manage the slaves. So those became the indentured servants. Oftentimes, some were used as slave patrols. These slave patrols basically were used to protect property. They were given a slightly more degree of power. These slave patrols could basically control the enslaved people as they saw fit without killing them. These indentured servants, some of them became overseers on the plantation. Some of the indentured servants who may have had served out their servitude, they might become a landless farmer, so they're able to sustain themselves alone. Uh, and so the more you moved away from the enslaved population, you gain more power as you moved up the pyramid scheme. However, for enslaved people, there became more and more laws that inscribed them as enslaved people who would never have their freedom. So in those very early days of this pyramid scheme, Africans were at the bottom of the scheme, and at the very top were white male landowners. In the very beginning, these are the people who could vote. These are the people who inscribed the Constitution. These were white male landowners. So every other white male who may have been an indentured servant or a landless farmer, they couldn't even vote. It was after the 1600s, well into the 1700s, when all white men could vote. So you're talking about a very, very small group of people who controlled all the power. And I would say that's the 1%. So you can go to the next slide. And that picture on the left is a picture, and this picture on the right are pictures from the Whitney plantation in New Orleans. And so in thinking about the plantation, we're still with the pyramid scheme. And so you see how the former indentured servants, become free. They're gaining more power, and they're moving up the social order. Some people might say the social ladder. This becomes important because when looking at culture, you can predict the future of a culture if you can identify the original organization, the original myth. So this pyramid scheme, I argue, continues to recapitulate through American culture over and over and over again. So in thinking about the slave culture, there were the slaves who worked in the field. There were the slaves who worked in the house. And so if you worked in the house, you got to be closer to the power. There were freed enslaved people. They had a little bit of power, but as you know, the contracts with freed enslaved people was not always binding, and sometimes people were re-enslaved. And the ability to own property was not always possible for freed slaves. There was a little bit more power, a little bit more up the social order. But the plantation culture, many people call today's capitalistic system plantation capitalism because basically it is the same structure. So if you can go to the next slide. So here's the hierarchy. You see the field hands, there are town slaves, there are domestic slaves. And I think I call this, in the realm of toxic patriarchy, because patriarchies are built on hierarchies, top down, bottom up. And I think it's toxic for many, many different reasons. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So I think is there one more slide? No, so you can go back. I think sometimes when people look at social orders of the slave plantation, they also include in this structure mulattoes. Mulattoes were above the slaves slightly. And I think this is how we incorporate colorism into the slave hierarchy. The field hands, the town slaves, the domestic slaves, the mulattoes all exerted a different significance on the hierarchy, on the pyramid scheme. And this, coming from Europe, this pyramid scheme has been used across the world. So in traveling to many places in Africa, it's the same sort of divide and conquer based on a hierarchy. It was the same thing that King Leopold used when he went to the Congo and appropriated a massive amount of lands for his own use. And it was a pyramid scheme of torture. So in the early days after 1885, after the carving up of Africa, King Leopold would send his investors to the Congo, and this is when rubber was becoming a commodity. If the enslaved people did not bring back enough rubber, he would chop off their arms. And so today in Belgium, you can see monuments with hands in remembrance of King Leopold, this vicious leader of Belgium who killed about 10 million Africans. So he was also planted seeds in Rwanda. Rwanda was a creation. The people in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, were basically the same ethnicity, the same people, sometimes the same family. But in order to make this pyramid scheme work, they invented races, the Tutsis and the Hutus. They would do things like measuring eyes or noses or looking at skin color. So colorism, and you can look at colorism across the globe, in Korea, in Australia, in New Zealand. It has been noted that in every culture in the world, the darkest people are the ones who are most incarcerated. So colorism in the United States is a little bit different from every other place. In Haiti, when you go to Port-au-Prince, the darker skinned people have historically lived at sea level. In the capital city, there's a huge mountain that you can go up. And at the top of the capital city, there's a place called Pétionville. Pétionville is where the Creoles live. Creoles are the mulattoes. These are the ones who own all the power, the ones who own all the businesses, the ones who are successful, the ones who have been able to come and go as they please. These people are aligned to power. They're the ones who are able to appropriate more power in order to be world players. So color within the context of slavery still impacts us today. So when you look at the pyramid scheme and you think about the historical top of the pyramid scheme, we can still look at that same model today when we think about capitalism. And as I said, some people call our capitalism plantation capitalism. You look at someone like Jeff Bezos, who has more than $150 billion, and he pays his workers a very small amount of work. So thinking about them being at the bottom of that pyramid scheme, and you think about someone like Michael Bloomberg, for instance, as being a billionaire who, when he was mayor of New York City, carried out a torturous, oppressive patrol of African American men and men of color. So you think about those same practices of the slave hierarchy, the slave toxic triangle recapitulating over and over and over again, not only in the United States, but across the world in terms of racial hierarchy. And this is toxic, and these are toxic traumas that keep impacting us as people. And so in order to move beyond that, it becomes important to recognize how it's working, to recognize this plantation capitalism, this toxic form of patriarchy that Jeff Bezos and all of the big billionaires are carrying out around the world. It has nothing to do with hard work or pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, but it's about using the system for your favor, no matter how much it might harm other people. And in order to continue doing this, there has to be a classification of people based on race and skin color. So when we talk about race, it really is impossible to talk about race without also talking about capitalism. And so there's a big movement that they don't use plantation capitalism as their frame, but they talk about racial capitalism. And so in order to understand where we are today, we have to take the long view back and look at how these racial hierarchies have also been joined together to impact us, because they continue to impact us today. And if we don't pay attention to those hierarchies, we're going to be hurt and harmed more. We cannot be asleep. This toxic patriarchy is something that kicked in high gear once again. It always kicks in. So after the Civil War, when African Americans or formerly enslaved people gained freedom, there was a very, very short window where Black men could vote. We had a high number of Black congresspeople. But in response to that, that's when slave patrols, which morphed into police officers, kicked in even in higher gear. That's when Jim Crow era policies started. So during slavery, slaves were not lynched, although they lived in torture. After the first civil rights movement, after the Emancipation Proclamation, that's when the lynching kicked into high gear, and that went up to the 1960s, as we know. So after the second civil rights movement of the 1960s that we all know, in response to that, a high form of toxic patriarchy kicked in again. So you have the policies of Richard Nixon, and that we've still been in that movement up until now, and we're in the middle of a lot of change. But this whole last 50 years has been a period of toxic matriarchy. So how do we move beyond this? How do we move beyond this hierarchy of toxicity and oppression? And I think us as Africans and African Americans, to think about who we are as people, what's in our DNA, what comes from Africa. One of the things that comes from Africa for many of us descendants of enslaved people is that many of us came from West African cultures. In many West African cultures, these are matriarchal cultures. And matriarchy, unlike the patriarchy that is built on hierarchies, a matriarchy, everyone's on the same level. And for me, this is the work that I've been doing for the last few years, is working in circles, working with highly traumatized uh, adolescents, and everything is done in a circle. Everyone's on the same level. Everyone gets to talk. Everyone gets to share their story, where story is their medicine. And these circles have been used around the world. Many indigenous cultures, instead of working on the predatory hierarchy of this toxic pyramid scheme, everyone sits in a circle. It might be called a circle of elders, a wisdom circle, the way of counsel, a restorative justice circle. But the important thing is that everyone is on the same level. And you don't have this predatory, vicious cycle of someone owning $150 billion, but not paying their workers to, health care insurance, or to see their workers be the ones who are on the front lines of the coronavirus. This is a form of vicious, toxic patriarchy that harms people. It takes a lot to create $1 billion, but you have someone in the world who has $150 billion. So when we bring, the smaller we reduce this pyramid and flatten it, that is our healing. And so when we smash down the divisions within the African American culture, when we're thinking about colorism, when we're thinking about gender, when we're thinking about religion and religious differences, the more that we flatten that pyramid, we move closer towards our healing. And when we begin to drown out the noise of division and realize that we are one people, and when you look at this circle, everyone in that circle is important. If one of those people were removed from the circle wouldn't be that circle. And that is true for our healing. That is true for our humanity. That is true for our health. It is true in ways that circles are used to help people to reduce trauma and to become a part of belonging. And the whole narrative of the United States has been, especially for people, poor people, people of color, people of African descent, is that you don't belong here. And the wider that gap is in that triangle, the bigger the difference between the bottom and the top. That is, the bigger differences are accented, and it becomes a very, very dangerous structure. And we see that as it plays out today, when people have less and less, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots has increased, so also increases the violence. So if we want to be a healthy nation, if we want to be a healthy people, we have to really think about flattening that gap. So thank you all very much. If you have questions at the end, I'll be here to answer them. Thank you.